In this video, we will be servicing the front brakes in this 2001 Ford F-150. Once you put the wheel chocks in place, jack up the vehicle and support it with safety stands, you can remove the tire and we can take a look at the various components behind the tire. Looking at this from the outside, we have our rotor, which is the round disc. We have our brake assembly, which consists of the caliper and other hardware. And also our brake pads are located within that brake assembly unit. If we focus more closely on the brake assembly, we can see where the brake pads sit beneath the caliper housing. If we take a look around the side of the caliper housing, we can see that there are two view holes in the caliper that will allow us to take a look at our brake pads. If we take a look in the top view hole, we can see where the caliper piston is. We can see the brake backing plate, and we can see the brake pad itself. Next, we can also see the rotor and the brake pad on the other side of the rotor as well. Additionally, we have this metal brake hardware that is viewable through that view hole as well. If we take a look through the lower view hole, we can also see the piston. We can see the brake backing plate and the brake pad itself. We have our rotor and then the brake pad for the other side, and additionally that brake hardware. Based off of this initial assessment, I'm going to estimate there is about 50% left on these brake pads. Typically when the brake backing plate is the same thickness as the brake pad itself, it is estimated that there is about 50% left. This would calculate to roughly 20 to 30,000 miles. If we continue further around the brake caliper housing unit, we will notice that there are two caliper bolts that hold the caliper unit to the braking system. When we service the brakes, these are the two bolts that we're going to remove to get us access to our brake assembly. Additionally, you will notice that there is a brake line which is filled with brake fluid that goes from in the engine down to the brake caliper assembly. To remove the caliper bolts, I'm first going to spray a little bit of Amsoil's MP metal protector, which acts as a penetrating oil to help loosen the bolts so I don't break them off if they're stuck. I'm going to let that soak in for a few minutes and spray some on the other bolt. Now you want to make sure that you're not spraying this on the rotor itself, because that could lead to a dangerous situation having that lubricant on the rotor itself when you're trying to stop. Next, I'm going to take a 1/2 inch socket and loosen the bolt. Upon initial inspection of the brake unit, I didn't see any fluid leaking, I didn't see any wet areas, and it appeared to be in pretty good condition. After that, we can slip the caliper off of the brake assembly. As we now take a look at our brake pads, we can get a much better idea of the actual thickness of the pad material because that caliper housing has been removed. We can gently wiggle the brake pads out away from the rotor so that we can inspect them a little better. Visually taking a look at our brake pads, they seem to be in fairly decent condition. There are no large scores or grooves in the pad material themselves. If we take a look at the thickness of the pad on the brake pad that was on the outside, we can notice that our initial assessment of it being about 50% left is somewhat incorrect. The right side of the pad, we have a distance that is a little bit less than the backing plate. The left side of the pad, we have a thickness quite a bit less than the backing plate. After taking a look at the pad off of the vehicle, I would say these pads possibly have 20% left. If I switch my attention over to the pad that was on the back side of my brake assembly, this pad also looks to only have roughly 20 to 30% left. Additionally, it does not look to be in very good condition. There's a lot of the coating that has been coming off, and this particular coating could get in between the brake pad and the rotor, causing an unsafe condition or scoring of the rotor and or brake pad. Now, this does bring up a good point that by just looking through those view holes on the caliper assembly, it doesn't really give us an accurate prediction of how much is left on these brake pads. Based on my assessment of these pads, once we remove them from the vehicle, these pads should be replaced. The next thing that I like to take a look at is the rotor itself. I will feel the rotor to see if it feels like there is any large scores or scratches in it. This one feels pretty good on both sides. That's a good indication that we may just be able to turn down these rotors and not have to replace them with new ones. Using a 0 to 1 inch micrometer, we can measure the thickness of the rotor. The micrometer indicated that the current thickness of this rotor is 0.962 inches. If I log on to O'Reilly Auto Parts, I can select my vehicle, which is a 2001 Ford F150. It is a engine code L, which is the 8th digit of your VIN number. I'm going to type in rotor, and we're searching for brake drums and rotors. This is a 4-wheel drive vehicle, and we have a bunch of different parts that we can take a look at. So what I'm looking for is a front rotor, 4-wheel drive. This particular one is a 7 lug. I'm actually looking for a 5 lug, but this one is for the rear, so I'm going to keep looking. So if I scroll back up to the top here, I find a front rotor, 4-wheel drive, 5 lug. Let's take a look at the specs on this particular rotor. And we can see that this particular rotor has a discard thickness of 0.965, which is the minimum that this rotor can be before we need to throw it away, or it could cause a potentially dangerous situation with your braking system. After taking a look at the rotor discard thickness online at O'Reilly's, it is evident that the rotors that are currently on this vehicle have already exceeded the discard thickness, meaning that they are too thin, which could lead to an unsafe situation. So for this particular vehicle, we will be replacing the rotors as well. The last component that we're going to take a look at is the brake hardware. Now, the brake hardware, if it is in good condition, sometimes you can reuse it, but realistically it's cheap enough that since we're replacing all of these other components, we're going to go ahead and replace the brake hardware as well. It is always good to also look at the pistons in the caliper housing and look for leaks, look for any moisture or wetness, and look for cracks in the boot. Prior to beginning any work, I've made sure that I've secured the caliper onto the vehicle using an old coat hanger. And my purpose in doing this is I don't want the caliper to fall and put tension on that brake line and potentially rupture that brake line. So by doing this, you're protecting the caliper from falling, but also you're protecting that brake line from potentially being damaged. Shifting our attention over to the back side of the rotor, we have a mounting bracket which goes around the rotor and is held on by 2 bolts. To be able to remove the rotor, we must remove these 2 bolts first and remove the mounting bracket. Again, I'm going to be using some Amsoil's MP metal protector to help loosen the bolts. At this point, we have removed our caliper, we have removed our brake pads, we have inspected the brake pads and realized we needed new ones. We've taken measurements on our rotor, realized that we need new rotors, and we have removed the mounting bracket for our caliper. At this point, we should be able to remove the rotor. However, if I attempt to move that rotor, it's stuck on there pretty good. So I'm going to take some Amsoil metal protector and I'm going to lubricate all of the studs for the wheel. Additionally, I'm going to lubricate the center hub, and I'm also going to lubricate back behind inside of the rotor. Now, Amsoil metal protector is going to act as a penetrating oil and help break free that rotor. Using a rubber mallet, I'm going to be hitting the rotor in a few different locations to help break free the rotor from the rest of the wheel assembly. Once removed, we can spray a little more Amsoil metal protector and take a wire brush and just clean off any buildup or junk that is left on there. I'm going to take a rag and wipe down any excess metal protector off of the various components. Once I've cleaned this up as best as I can, I'm going to coat it with heavy-duty metal protector, which is another Amsoil product. This particular one works great as an undercoat on vehicles. It will help resist a lot of the corrosion and degradation of the components due to rust or salt or other chemicals that may come in contact with it. After that, we need to unpackage and clean our new rotor with some type of brake parts cleaner. When they're shipped from the factory, they have a coating on them which will reduce the effectiveness of your brakes, because essentially it's covered in oil and that will decrease the braking ability of your brake pads. Then we can install our new rotor. And at this point, I like to clean it again since I've been touching it. And replace our mounting bracket. We will also want to remove the existing brake hardware, clean the bracket where the hardware was, and reinstall our new hardware. After that, we can slip our new brake pads into our new hardware. It should fit in pretty smoothly. After that, we need to reinstall our caliper back onto our brake pads and the rotor. However, we need to first reset the caliper pistons. If we look at the existing settings on the caliper pistons, the pistons are sticking out pretty far. And this is because the previous brake pads had been worn down quite a bit. The pistons compensate for the wearing of the brake pad. They move out, pushing the brake pads closer to the rotor. Our new brake pads are substantially thicker, so we need to push these pistons back in. Before we push these pistons back in, we need to take a look at the level that the brake fluid is at in the brake fluid reservoir, because when we push the pistons back in, that will force brake fluid back through the lines and ultimately into that brake fluid reservoir. If the brake fluid reservoir is all the way full, that's going to overflow and go all over our engine. Because the level of this brake fluid in this reservoir is at the current level it is, I think we should be all right and not have to remove any out of here. To do this, I'm first going to place an old brake pad in front of the pistons. Next, I'm going to place a C-clamp around the caliper and tighten it down until it comes in contact with the brake pad. Gently, I'm going to slowly tighten it, which is going to push the piston in. Now, on this one, I've set it up with 2 C-clamps because there are 2 pistons. And I'm going to tighten them at the same rate so that it slowly depresses those pistons. After that, we can remove the C-clamps and the brake pad, and our pistons are fully depressed. Now that the pistons have been depressed and we have replaced all of our hardware components and brake pads, we can reinstall the caliper onto our brake pads and install our caliper bolts And at this point, I like to clean all of the brake components once more before I install the tires. Prior to starting the vehicle or driving it, you want to make sure and press the brake pedal in multiple times until the brakes feel firm, because what we need to do is reset those pistons back onto the brake pads.